Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago, former Governor Jim Edgar explains why he is opposed to enacting term limits on Illinois politicians. This runs about 30 minutes.
Okay, disclaimer. I do work for the IGPA, but I'm not here speaking for the IGPA, so I do have opinions. And these are my opinions. They're not the IGPA's, not the University of Illinois. President of the university gets very nervous every time there's an election and I start getting vocal. But academic freedom, and that's what I'm going to use here today. Secondly, my comments on term limits really apply to the state legislature. And I think that's what this constitutional amendment's about. It's not about city council, which maybe does need term limits or an IQ test or something. And I can't speak for Congress, and it does strike me from afar that those people do stay for a long time. But I'm going to talk about my view on Springfield and whether I think it's good or not. When Andy first called me, I thought, I don't really have strong feelings on term limits. When it first came up in the 90s, I didn't think it was a very good idea. I just have always thought that really the electorate ought to determine how long a person, particularly in the legislature, stays in office. And one of the reasons I've never been excited about term limits for the legislative branch of government is that I think the legislative branch of government, in this balance of power, which I think is very important to make our system work, they provide the longevity. They provide the historical perspective on government. A governor usually comes on the scene, then leaves, while legislators stay for a long time. And I think that balance works pretty well, because I expect the executive branch, particularly the governor, to come in with some fresh ideas. Probably most of them have been tried before, and the legislators know that, and they'll have to explain that to him. But sometimes that time has come for that new ideal. So that balance, I think, works pretty well. If everybody was new on the job, or pretty new, I'm not sure we would get the best results. So that's one of the reasons I've always been rather apprehensive about term limits. The other was because my mentor, people always say, who's your mentor? My mentor in government was W. Russell Arrington, who was the Senate Republican leader. Back then they were called the President Pro Tem because the Lieutenant Governor still presided in the Senate, but he was the power. Mike Madigan is the Russ Arrington of today, at least all the good things about Mike Madigan. Russ Arrington made the modern legislature, brought it into the 20th century, and made it a co-equal with the executive branch of government. Now, if they'd had term limits, he'd have never been leader, because he was in the legislature 20 years before the Young Turks threw out the old guard and decided they wanted somebody with some experience, and they brought in Russ Arrington as a surprise to everyone, and then he completely changed the whole legislative process in Springfield. That wouldn't have happened if we'd have had term limits. So again, I've always been a little apprehensive on term limits for the Illinois legislature. Now, since the 90s, we've had states adopted, and we've had studies, and Carl, I guess he didn't hold up the book that he, along with some others, published a few years ago and worked on, and I think was very good, that I actually read the other day. One of the few pamphlets out of a not-for-profit I've probably read all the way through, but on term limits. And reading through that, and they kind of put both sides in with, but I think if you look at the facts, it reassured me that probably term limits weren't what we needed in Illinois. One of the things that surprised me a little bit, I hadn't thought about before, that term limits really would shift the power more to the executive branch of government. Now, I can see, as someone who wants to be governor or is governor, term limits might have their pluses. In fact, I have to be very candid. There were days when I was governor, I didn't want term limits. I just wanted to abolish the whole institution of the Illinois General Assembly. But as I reflect back, it was probably good they were there, because while usually I was right, I wasn't always right. And sometimes Mike Madigan actually might have been right, not very often, but sometimes. But more importantly, Mike Madigan and Jim Edgar together often could come up with the right solution. And I think that balance is needed. I think the problem today isn't the legislature stays too long. It's the legislature and the governor can't sit down and kind of work things out. And one of the things I was thinking about too, if you had a turnover of legislators pretty rapidly, I just think in Congress, I'm not sure if I was the president or if I was the governor dealing with equivalent, I'd much rather deal with Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy than I would Ted Cruz and the Tea Party group. I just think to get things done, one of the things that's very true, I think the study showed, and I just want to reemphasize it here, a lot of times when people are new in the legislative process, and I was the same way, I've got all the answers. And everything that's been done before is wrong, and we need to change it all. And I want it my way. The word compromise or finding a common ground just really doesn't enter into it. Now, after a few years, you begin to realize, hey, there's other people here that come from other parts of the state with different ideology, with different points of view. And after a while, you realize, well, they're not always wrong, and I'm not always right. And that ability to work together to find the common ground, to me, is the key to making a democracy work. And I worry that if we have a rapid turnover in Springfield in the legislative branch, and we usually get a new governor, well, recently we've been getting them a lot quicker than we have in the past for a variety of reasons, but let's say every 8 years. I just think we need more of a balance. And again, I'm not sure term limits would allow us to have that balance we need. Now, as was true in many of the other major states where you saw term limits implemented, it really wasn't driven because legislators have stayed too long. And I think in Illinois, we have a pretty good turnover between elections and redistricting. And I also want to touch on redistricting in a minute. We do get a turnover. Maybe not as much as we would with term limits, but still there's a turnover. The problem in Illinois, as it was in some of these other states, is not the rank and file. It's we've had one person as speaker now for, 30 years? I swore him in 30 years ago as speaker when I was Secretary of State, except for 2 years. And if Mike Madigan was not the speaker, I do not think we would be having this conference today. I don't think maybe that constitutional amendment would even been thought of, or wouldn't be going as well as it's going. So perhaps we need to look at what the problem is. Is the problem the speaker's been there too long? And I think you can make a case. Anybody can be someplace too long when they have that much power. A governor, as mentioned, I voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms. I was tired. I was worn out after 2 terms. It wasn't just my heart. Actually, the doctors told me I could stay, though they thought the Senate would be a better place. They said it's kind of like a halfway house. But if I wanted to run for governor, and I would like to try to put to rest forever, Brenda did not talk me out of running for governor in 1998 or in 2006. Brenda's much smarter than to tell me that. I knew what Brenda thought, but Brenda left it up to me because she said, if I make you do something and you don't want to do it, then I've got to live with you for the next 20 years, and it's not going to be a pretty sight. So she did not try to insist. But I actually was tired. I think you can make a case for term limits when it comes to the executive branch of government. Again, maybe it can apply to the mayor of Chicago. I don't think there's any doubt that the longer you're in at that level, when you have that much power, you do begin to believe your own press releases. You do think that you're infallible. And perhaps the speaker or the presiding officers, you might make a case that after 10 years or whatever, it's probably time for a change. I think we've only had one, and that's been Speaker Madigan. And I have to tell you, I dealt with Madigan. And I fought with Madigan. In fact, I had bypass surgery, and 2 of the bypasses was because of Mike Madigan. One was Medicaid, and I think the other might have been paid Phillip. But Mike Madigan is the smartest guy I dealt with in Springfield. I always said when I was in Springfield, he was the smartest guy in Springfield. And he was a tough guy. So I don't think we ought to just change our Constitution because some people think Mike Madigan's been there too long. And then the other thing I realized, even if we do this, we're going to have Mike Madigan for 8 more years. Good heavens, what, he's going to be 81? Is that what the age is? I mean, eventually Mike Madigan will leave on his own. I'm convinced if you pass this, he'll stay for 8 years just to spite everybody. Now, I know that politically, the people, if you ask the people, they want this. Just as they wanted to do away with cumulative voting. You know, we had a wannabe governor back then named Pat Quinn who pushed that through. We now have a wannabe governor, Bruce Rauner, who's pushing this one. And I got to say, it is smart politics. I don't think, though, it's very good government. Just as cumulative voting turned out, I don't think to be doing away with that. And people voted to do away with cumulative voting, but not because they didn't understand or care about cumulative voting. They're going to get rid of 59 politicians. That's why it passed. And this time, I think the same is true. Most people are going to vote for this, and I think they will vote for it, because they just want to get rid of some politicians. And while I understand that politically, governmentally, I don't think that's the best long-term for this state. The other thing I would caution everyone, we don't know for sure what will happen. We know there will be a change. Might be better, might be worse. We could sit, and that's what part of this discussion is about today. But it will be somewhat chaos. And the last thing Illinois state government needs is any more chaos. We need some stability. We need some, let's get this ship back on track. I'm not convinced this does it. I really think that if we want meaningful reform, it's not the cutback amendment. I think the key is changing the way we redistrict in this state. And I've worked on reapportionment, and I used to think there's no other way to do it than the way it's set up. I've come to the conclusion we need to change that. That's really, I think, what's caused more of the problem than some legislators have stayed too long. It's the fact that on election day, we don't often have a choice. There is often no competition because these legislative districts are drawn where they're all Republican or they're all Democrat. And if you didn't vote in the primary, and a lot of people don't vote in the primary because one thing, we have primaries way too early in this state. At least this year it wasn't Groundhog Day. We did move it back to March. But we ought to be in the summer like most other states, and people maybe would be more involved in primaries. But we also ought to have districts in this state where there's actually some question on election day. We call them swing districts. That means you have a good number of Republicans and Democrats in those districts, and that means a candidate has to appeal to more than just a few people who show up at a primary on whether they're going to be elected or reelected. So to me, the most meaningful reform we could do in Illinois is not the cutback amendment, which makes me nervous. I'm not sure it's as Carl Kurtz pointed out, it really didn't change as much as some people thought it would change. But right now, I don't think Illinois needs any instability. We need some stability in state government. But I do believe that the redistricting process needs to be overhauled. I don't think we ought to have all these safe districts and everything decided in a primary in the dead of winter when just a few people show up. I think we ought to have elections mean something in November for the legislature. And also, if a legislator knew they had to not only appeal to a few people in a primary who have a tendency to be kind of to the extreme of their party in both parties in the primary, but they had to appeal to both Republicans and Democrats and independents to get elected, I think, again, state government would work a lot better. I think we would find it much more probable that we would find common ground, that we wouldn't pit downstate against Chicago. Republicans and Democrats actually would know each other and speak to each other. So that, to me, is the real reform we need in Illinois. I'm afraid this might set us back. I'm not convinced it'll do all the wonderful things that people think it will do unless you do want chaos even more in Springfield. It's hard to believe there could be more chaos in Springfield than there is, but it could happen. And if you really want a legislature that's not an equal partner with the executive branch, I really believe we need that equal partner. We need that balance of power that really is part of the essential of a democracy. So with that, let me stop. I'll be happy. You want to take questions? I'm more than happy. Take any questions you might have. The legislature and the governor in the past made some mistakes on legislation. I think we also, and I'll include myself not on the legislation because I will defend what we signed when I was governor. We did have a problem when I was first governor. The policy of the previous administration had been not to fully fund. They would put in what they thought was necessary for payouts. And the first 3 years I was governor, we were basically bankrupt, and we didn't have the money to start doing it. The fourth year, we did, surprisingly, an election year, pass a pension reform proposal that Speaker Madigan and I agreed on, that my Democratic opponent, Don Clark Netsch, wanted to strangle Madigan for kind of taking away an issue for her in the general election. But it was a good proposal. It didn't solve all the problems, but it did require discipline. Unfortunately, that discipline didn't last. We didn't keep reviewing it as we were supposed to, and also not increase pension benefits as they did later on when he did an early retirement and did some things. No, there are times when everybody can get together and it's not good, but I would say more times than not, people have got to get together just to make government work. Again, you've got folks on the outside keeping an eye. The media plays a very important role in making a democracy work, in calling us to task. I love talking to journalism students at U of I. One reason I like to get to them before they ruin somebody's career. But also, as I tell them, I said, you are the fourth branch. You're not in the Constitution, but you are the fourth branch. So I think more times than not, we need folks to get together in elected office and try to find common ground. I think if you're worried they're going to find common ground that's really not good for the public, I think, again, the media plays a very important role in keeping an eye on that. I used to get up every morning and know when I was governor, I not only had to worry about the Democratic Party, I also had to worry about the Republican Party a lot. I knew I had to worry about the media too. My press secretary had a great line. Every morning I'd get up, my routine, I'd get up and get on the treadmill and I'd start thinking about the problems of the day. And I would usually, by the time I got done 30 minutes on the treadmill, I had a scheme figured out how I was going to deal with this problem. And it was a scheme. And by the time I hit the shower, I had it pretty well perfected. And I thought it worked pretty well. Well, I'd always walk over to the Capitol every morning, and I'd walk over and I'd be getting it all polished, ready, and I'd assemble my staff. And then I'd say it out loud. And I noticed when I said it out loud, it didn't just seem as good as when I was thinking about it in my mind. And my press secretary, Mike Lawrence, would be sitting there, and Mike was very diplomatic. He never said, "Governor, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard." Mike, he believed in job security. And Mike, he smoked a pipe, but you couldn't smoke in the Capitol, so he just chewed on it. And he said, "Well, Governor, that sounds real good. How do you think that's going to read on the front page of the Chicago Tribune?" And I thought, well, those people in the Tribune, it's not going to read very good. And that would kind of get me back down. And so again, that was part of the checks and balances that I really think is essential. But in no way do I want to suggest that an effective check and balance is the two parties or both sides can't get together and kind of reach a compromise. Because if that doesn't happen, and we've seen that in the last few years with one-party control, one-party rule, I don't think we get the best public policy. I think when both parties get together and compromise, and the media is watching, which means the public's informed, I think we get pretty good public policy. And I really think in the past we got pretty good public policy. Sometimes it took us a while to get there, and sometimes we made mistakes, but I think overall it worked pretty well. I don't think it's worked in the last few years, and I can appreciate people's frustration with Springfield. But I'm not convinced this is the solution. I think if we changed how we drew those maps and made sure there was more competition on Election Day, I think we could go a long way in trying to make state government work better again.
Thank you, Governor. Appreciate your comments. Along the lines of the prior question, What are some steps that I think can be taken between non-for-profit organizations, private citizens, as well as government agencies to really engage the electorate in a way that they might have been feeling a level of disengagement and kind of a malaise of not participating at the primary level, and with all the different layers of government that people have to really sift through? What are some steps that you believe can be taken on both sides to really re-engage the electorate?
Well, there's no doubt. I think the 28% figure, people don't, percent of people trust or have any confidence in Illinois state government. There's no doubt, I think, elected officials have to keep that in mind every day. And everything they do, and I don't think most elected officials ever think they're going to do something illegal. But sometimes they do some outrageous things. They just do silly things. And they just got to stop doing that. And, you know, and I realize that they feel strongly on their convictions and sometimes their emotions get carried away, but they need to be, civility needs to return to government. It's not just Springfield, probably even more so in Washington, D.C. But I'm not here to talk about Washington, D.C. I'll leave that to other people to figure out. But civility, I think, is something. And so I think that we need to encourage that among public officials. It's as important as the ability to compromise, is that to be, you can disagree, but disagree in a civil way. One of the things I learned, the guy I'm disagreeing with today very well might be my ally tomorrow on another issue. And so you don't want to burn bridges. But I think if people in government were more civil, and I think the public would begin to have a higher impression of them. And if there's any doubt in your mind that what you might be doing might be crossing the line, don't do it. If it even gets close to it, don't do it, because, again, that's going to undercut public confidence in state officials. I always tell people, when I talk on leadership, one of the most important people, the people around you. Now, legislators don't have a huge staff. They're not like a governor. And so they don't maybe have as many people around them. But I was fortunate I had staff around me who were not afraid, in a very nice way, to try to bring me back down to earth and to keep my ego, you know, somewhat in reasonable size. I mean, it is a problem. Power corrupts, and absolute power absolutely corrupts. There's some truth to that. So you need people around you who will keep your feet on the ground. Now, I always had that when I went home. Brenda did not hesitate. But you need something more than just your spouse. You need people around you, and you need to make them know that they can, in a nice way, criticize some of your thoughts without you blowing up at them. Because there have been some public officials who I think have gotten in trouble because they didn't encourage their staff or didn't like their staff to tell them they were wrong. And we're all going to be wrong. And we don't like to hear it, but we need to be willing to hear it and not bite the head off of the person who's brave enough to tell us. Yes, ma'am. Okay, excuse me.
My question is both a campaigning and a government question. We've all been through our primary campaign. And my two questions about campaigning and governor are, one, what would you consider as the most important campaign advice you can give to Runner in his fall campaign? And secondly, in the context of what you've said today, and in the context of Runner's primary campaign, if Runner is elected, what is the most important advice that you can give him?
Well, I hate to give the advice publicly. In fact, he did call, and he's going to come and talk to me in a couple of days, so I'll give him some advice. Well, one of the things, and I did election night, and we've all been through. I went through the Rauner campaign. I want to make clear I was on, the other campaign in that primary. I watched the Rauner campaign. Politically, it was very effective, his topic about we're going to shake Springfield up and kind of, he didn't say throw the bums out, but kind of implied that, and that was probably a pretty good strategy in the primary, in a Republican primary. I'm not sure that's a great strategy to govern by. And I think you always got to keep in mind when you're running that the goal is to govern. It's not just to win the election. And I tell this to students and people I talk to who are running, if you're just running so you can run for re-election, don't do it. It's not worth it. The pay's not that good. They're cutting back your pension. I mean, you're just not that good. But if you want to get something done, there's nothing better than public service. If you really want to have an impact on people, there's nothing better. So you got to keep that in mind when you're running, that you don't want to do something that's going to impede your ability to govern. And one of the things that's going to be very important for a Republican, if he's fortunate enough to be elected governor, whether he likes it or not, he's going to be dealing with the Democrat legislature. I mean, that map is drawn in such a way, there's no way they're going to lose control in this election. And so you're going to have to live with a Democratic-controlled legislature. And even if you get this passed, it doesn't take effect for a while. And you still, there's a balance of power. You've got to work with them. You can't go around them. And we've had governors try that. I remember Dan Walker. Didn't work. And, it's far better to try to sit down and figure out where you can agree and find that common ground. But you can't do that if there's been a lack of civility. And this applies both ways, not just to the gubernatorial candidate, but also to the legislative leaders. There's been a lot of speculation about how close he is to the mayor of Chicago. And I have to say that I had my difficulties with the mayor of Chicago when I was governor. And I wish we hadn't disagreed, but I often had to say no, and that wasn't a word the mayor was used to. I tried to always keep it civil. But there is a lot of comment about Rounders being pretty close to the mayor of Chicago, and I think that'd be a great asset. But it's far more important that the governor has a good working relationship with the speaker than with the mayor. And so I guess I would just say keep that in mind. That doesn't mean you don't disagree on issues, but be sure you don't let it sound personal. You keep it as civil as possible, because you're going to have to work with those individuals. And also, I must say, as a Republican, and it's even worse now than when I was governor. When I was running for governor, there weren't enough Republicans to elect me anything statewide in this state. You had to have independents and what I call thoughtful Democrats to be able to win. And that's even more true today. And so I think you got to keep that in mind. Again, a primary, particularly a small turnout primary as this was, there's just a small group that kind of determines that. You go to the general election, it's a much broader group, and it's much more diverse. You're going to have to, be able to win enough of those people who aren't normally Republicans to win. Now, I think Rounder's first steps were in the right direction. He very quickly held press conferences talking about Democrats who were for him, minorities who were for him, and that, to me, is what he's got to project in this campaign. But I also would be very careful about, burning any bridges with people you're going to have to deal with once you're elected governor.
Could you just comment on the other two parts of the term limits proposal here? The one about changing the districts to 41 senator districts and 123 representatives, and changing it so that there's a 2/3 vote, which
Well, I really didn't. I about fell out of my chair when I saw those, to be truthful. They are getting rid of politicians. I mean, it's the old kind of Quinn approach on the cumulative voting. You're reducing. I'm not sure why they're doing that, except you're getting rid of politicians, and that plays well. I was a state representative. I started out in the legislative branch of government. In fact, I spent a year working with NCSL when I first started. So I've got some legislative roots. I have to tell you, though, after I went over the executive branch, I quickly saw the error of my past and realized the executive branch really will keep you safe at night. But the 2/3 definitely would be a huge shift in power to the governor. Huge shift. 3/5 is difficult to get in most cases, and I think is a reasonable number. 2/3, any governor worth his salt should never get overridden with 2/3. I mean, the governor's got so many goodies, even in this day and age of change, that he could get enough legislators to have a sick son and they have to leave the session or whatever. 3/5, I mean, 3/5 is kind of what the 1970 Constitution put in, and I think, I don't understand why we're changing that unless you just want to give more power to the governor. Reducing the size, I don't understand either. I will say, as a former state representative in downstate Illinois, you got to drive a lot farther to see people. If you go this way, a senator downstate needs to buy a plane. So I don't think it, you know, we're set up. We did reduce the House, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. No, I guess it's 30 years ago now. I'm not sure we need to reduce the legislature. As large, as diverse as the state is, I don't think the legislature is too big. So I don't see the need for those two. I was actually surprised. I didn't realize until he was going through that was in the proposal. I hadn't heard that much discussion about it.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you all very much.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.